Pakistan is demanding compensation from the rich and the developed nations for their contribution towards the climate change. Hello and welcome to the In Focus series section of Drishti IAS. I am Aisha Singh, and in today's video we will be talking about the idea of climate reparation. So first let us look at the timeline of the video. First we will be looking at what is news, then what is the idea of climate reparation, historical emissions argument, and then the admission of responsibility for the developed countries, developed nation reluctance in taking the responsibilities and compensating for it, then what is the quantum of loss and how it can be adjusted. In the end, we will be looking into a prelims MCQ and a mains practice question. This topic is of relevance from General Studies Paper 3, Environment, Climate Change. See, from exam perspective, you should be able to know that what is the idea of climate reparation, then what are the historical emissions argument, which are the countries which are majorly contributing towards the climate change or the greenhouse gases emissions, and what is the admission of responsibility. So let's get started and see the news. This news has been taken from the Indian Express and it says, difficult to implement, what is the idea of climate reparation? So in this news, the central idea that we will be discussing would be what is climate reparation and why is the word climate reparation so much in news. So recently what has happened is Pakistan is suffering from its worst ever flood in its history, and it has led to loss of lives and loss of property, and more than 1,300 people have lost their lives, and economic damages worth billions of dollars has happened. So, and Pakistan's biggest lake, which is Manchar Lake, situated in the Sindh province, is on the verge of bursting its bank and flooding surrounding areas. Already the water is all over Pakistan, and its biggest lake is on the verge of flooding. So what has happened is Pakistan has come up with a new idea of climate reparation, which the rich and the developed nation needs to do. See few of the pictures of the floods which is happening in Pakistan. This is the aerial view. So you can see it is filled with water all over around. So now let us understand what is the idea of climate reparation. So Pakistan has begun demanding reparations or compensation. So Pakistan is saying it wants compensation from the rich countries or the developed countries that are mainly responsible for causing climate change. Because if we see, since the time industrial revolution has taken place, that is the 17th and the 18th century, then it is the developed nations like the US and the UK and the European Union who are the major contributors towards the greenhouse gases or the climate change, while it is the developing and the poor countries which are on the verge of facing its consequences and are not able to deal with it. So this is the reason that Pakistan is saying that the floods which have caused is because of climate change, and Pakistan, being a developing country and a poor country when it comes to GDP and economy, want compensation from the rich countries who are responsible for these drastic climate extreme events. So Pakistan's Minister for Climate Change has said that country makes negligible contribution to global warming. It has been among the most vulnerable to climate change. So it means a country which is not contributing towards the climate change or towards the greenhouse gases emissions is a country who is facing its consequences. So what is the mistake of the country who is facing its consequences for doing something which the country is not responsible for, and the country is facing consequences for something which the rich and the developed nation has done. So they want a compensation or a reparation for it. The rich nations owe reparations to countries like Pakistan for the consequences of climate change. So if the rich countries and the developed countries are responsible for contributing the maximum to the climate change, then they should also be responsible for handling its consequences and contribute towards the poor and the developed nation when they suffer from drastic events of nature. Then principles being invoked are fairly well established in environmental jurisprudence, and Pakistan is not alone in making this demand. All other poor and developing countries, and especially the small island nation states, are also demanding that rich and the developed nation should compensate for the drastic events of nature which is taking place, and the poor and the small nations are suffering because of it. So international mechanism for financial compensation for loss and damage caused by climate disasters. So a financial mechanism or a financial compensation should be done to the poor and the developing countries. So this is what is the idea of climate reparation, that compensation needs to be given from the rich and the developed countries to the poor and the developing countries, because it is the developed nation who are responsible for the carrying out of the mechanism of climate change. So now let us understand the historical emissions argument, that is the extension of universally acknowledged polluter pay principle. It is said that polluter pay principle should be followed. So what is polluter pay principle? Polluter pay principle talks about that when a person or someone who is responsible for causing something should also be responsible for taking its responsibility or for taking its repercussions. Someone else should not deal with it. So someone who is causing it should also be someone who is taking responsibility for it. Then polluter liable for paying for the cost of remedial action, compensating the victims of environmental damage. So if the rich and the developed nations are majorly responsible for contributing towards the greenhouse gases emissions, then these countries should also be responsible for compensating to the poor and the developing countries who are bearing a cost for what the developed and the rich nations have done in the past or is still doing. Then loss and damage phenomena, that whatever loss and damage has been done should be compensated or should be looked after. Climate change framework says that the burden of responsibility falls on the rich countries. The rich countries have the technology, the rich countries have the mechanism, and the rich countries have the finances to deal with the extreme events, but the poor and the developing countries does not possess not even the technology and nor the finances. So the rich nations and the developed nations should look towards the developing countries. Contributed most of the greenhouse gases emissions since 1850. So the rich nations have done this, and 1850s was considered to be the beginning of the industrial age, and the countries responsible for it was United Nations and the European Union, including the United Kingdom. They contribute around 50% of all the emissions. Imagine the quantity, that 50% of all the emissions are coming from the United States, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. Then if we include Russia, Canada, Japan and Australia to it, then the combined contribution goes beyond 65%, which becomes almost 2/3 of all the emissions. So all these countries are what? They are the developed nations who are contributing 2/3 of the emissions. And the cumulative accumulation of this carbon dioxide that causes global warming. So India and China are also one of the biggest contributors nowadays, but in the past, during the times of 18th century, they were not someone who has contributed the much to the greenhouse gases emissions, and that is why the contribution since a long period of time of China and India is not very much as compared to the US or the European Union. India, third largest emitter, contributes about 3% of historical emissions. So this is the reason that why India does not come in the category of developed nations when it comes to contributing towards the greenhouse gases emissions. Very important prelims and a mains point, that India is the third largest emitter and 3% of historical emissions has been done by India. While on the other hand, China, which is the world's biggest emitter for over 15 years now, has also contributed about 11% to the total emissions since 1850s. So if you will compare the US and the European Union to the Asian regions, the difference is huge. They have contributed more than 50%, while the Asian countries have contributed around 18 to 20%. So severe on poorer nations, geographical locations and weaker capacity to cope. So when the rich nations are doing all these things, and because of the contribution towards the climate change, it is the poor countries which needs to face the brunt of it in the form of cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, droughts. And who are the countries who are not able to deal with these? Are the poor countries, because they lack the expertise, they lack the finance, they lack the technology, they lack almost everything, and they want someone else's guidance to make them learn that how to deal with all these consequences or how to deal with all these drastic situations. Then negligible contributions to historical emissions. So the poor and the developing countries have not contributed much to the climate change. Now let's come to the admission of responsibility. And according to the UNFCCC, that is United Nations Framework Convention to Climate Change, 1994, it says that the broad principle of the global effort to fight climate change explicitly, the important word here is explicitly acknowledges this differentiated responsibility of nations. So even the UNFCCC is explicitly acknowledging that there is differentiated responsibility of nation. What is the meaning of differentiated responsibility? What is its meaning? What is differentiated responsibility means? It means that every single country has a different role to play and has a different responsibility to handle. The countries which have contributed more should take more responsibility, while the countries which have contributed less or have negligible contribution should take less responsibility. And the rich and the developed nation should take more responsibility and guide the developing and the poor countries in giving them the knowledge that how to deal with the climate change extreme events if they face any of it. Then the rich countries must provide both the finance and the technology, because finance and technology are the two most important thing, because when the loss of life and property takes place, then it is the finances which comes into place. And when it comes to dealing with the techniques of the handling, how to handle the extreme events of nature, then the expertise and the technology of the rich countries comes into play. Then 100 billion amount rich countries agreed to provide every year to the developing world. What is the amount? It is the 100 billion amount which the rich countries, they promised to give it to the developing and the poor countries, but the implementation part of it is still lacking. Then the climate disasters were not a regular occurrence in 1994 because it is a gradual and a slow process. It was on an increasing mode. So in 90s, when it was not happening that fast, countries or the rich or the developed countries did not pay much attention towards it. But now that most of the severe atmospheric or the natural events are taking place, now it is coming into prominence. Then UNFCCC does not make a mention of loss and damages. Loss and damages UNFCCC does not talk about. Who talks about the loss and damages? It is the Warsaw International Mechanism, which was set up in 2013, talks about the loss and damage concept, that if there is loss and damages taking place, then the person or the organization or the country responsible for it should compensate for it. First formal acknowledgement. Important prelims point, that Warsaw International Mechanism was the first formal acknowledgement of the need to compensate developing countries struck by climate disasters. And who are the people or who are the organization or who are the countries who will be compensating the developing countries? They are the rich and the developed nation who are responsible over the years for contributing maximum to the greenhouse gases emissions, for the increase of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The progress is slow And the climate conference in Glasgow that took place, it says that 3-year task force was set up to discuss a funding arrangement. But these things about the climate change are slow and gradual. It takes time for its implementation process, and that is one of the major reasons that things get delayed. Then now let's talk about developed nations reluctance. Why developed nation is not contributing or not helping financially to the developing and the poor countries. It is because the loss and damage claims can easily spiral into billions of dollars or even more. When the situation is on national level, the damage that is done, the loss of life and the loss of damage that is done to a country goes into huge amount. The numbers becomes huge, it becomes monster. So the amount which goes into billions and beyond, this is the reason that even the developed or the rich countries are very reluctant to accept it. Then according to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Force, that is UNOCHA, climate linked disaster averaged 15.5 billion between 2019 and 2021. These kind of points you can write in your mains answer writing, because these adds good point and these are the value addition that you can do to your answer. Then economic loss from cyclone Amphan, which came in India and Bangladesh in 2020, it did a damage of around 15 billion. And United States alone the United States have inflicted more than 1.9 trillion in damages to other countries. So imagine when a developed and a rich country like United States is saying that 1.9 trillion in damages they are saying that they want from the other countries, then you can imagine that when the developed nations are inflicting 1.9 trillion of amount, this is not even the GDP of many countries. Then when they are asking from other countries, then how will the rich and the developed nation would help the poor and the developing countries when they are in need for something for which they are not even majorly responsible? Then non-economic losses. It is not only the financial losses which takes place, other kind of losses also takes place, which are the non-economic losses, including the loss of lives, displacement. Many people lose their homes and they have to displace or move from one place to another place. Then migration also takes place when a person moves from one country to another country or from one place to another place. Then health impacts. This is a huge problem. Diseases, pandemics are very much in prominence now, and health issues are so much relevant in today's time. And damage to cultural heritage also. Now let's talk about the quantum of loss. Not every loss and damage can be put up for compensation claims. Now the issue that rises is that everything which is happening cannot be said that the climate change is the reason for it. Whenever a volcano comes, every time it cannot be said that the climate change is the reason for it. Or every time a tsunami occurs, it cannot be said that climate change is a reason for it. Or every time a flood comes, many a times the reason can also be misgovernance. The misgovernance aspect is also one of the most prominent things which is coming up, as the urban planning is not done before setting up few of the things. Then practical difficulties in estimating how much a country has actually suffered, because half part can be like that this much has taken place because of climate change, but the other part has taken place because of some other reasons. Every time it cannot be possible that everything is taken place or every mishappening has happened because of the climate change. Then climate change has played a role or not to identify this is becoming a problem, and many new techniques needs to come up to identify that whether the climate change has played a part or not. Then misgovernance aspect, and one of the biggest reason is present times Bengaluru is also suffering from flood, and the reason for it is majorly misgovernance. Is the urban planning of the city has not been done properly. Then Pakistan has also received widespread support from the NGOs and the civil societies for its idea of climate reparations, because and all the poor and the developing countries are also supporting Pakistan in this aspect of climate reparations, that it is the rich countries which are responsible, and because of their doings or because of their wrongdoings and because of they were not able to stop themselves at the right moment of time or minimize their climate change or the greenhouse gases emissions, they also have to suffer. Last year also we saw that Indonesia has to shift its capital because of climate change events. So these are the drastic events which are happening in our surroundings, and these kind of examples only you people can write in your answer writing practice, because writing examples become very important. Few of the examples, see, one example can be Bengaluru flooding. So Bengaluru flooding is a good example of what? It is good example of misgovernance. Then Indonesia shifting its capital is a good example of climate change. And now that Pakistan's flood is also a good example of climate change. Then you also have to write about the increase of greenhouse gases or the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or the surroundings. Then the chlorofluorocarbons, the hydrofluorocarbons, who are also majorly responsible for the global warming or the climate change. Then these kind of points you have to write in your answers. Now let's move to the prelims MCQ, and the question is, the Warsaw International Mechanism leads to loss and damages concept, polluter pay principle, Kyoto Protocol, or none of the above. And you people need to tell me the answer in the comment section. Now let's move to the last aspect, that is the mains practice question. I've given you an easy one. Discuss the socio-economic impacts of climate change on the globe. This is a 10-marker question, and the command given here is discuss. So you have to talk about both the social aspect and the economic aspect of climate change. So start with writing something about the climate change, then about the social aspect or the economic aspect. Write a good conclusion and a way forward also to it. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Till we meet next time, keep reading and keep writing.